Good morning, everybody. This is Jeff Brown at 44 Days Radio Sinoland here in Beijing, China. And we are very, very honored and pleased today to have Mr. Caleb Maupin on the show today. Let me give Caleb a brief introduction. Caleb Maupin is a radical journalist and political analyst who resides in New York City. He is originally from Ohio. He studied political science at Baldwin Wallace College. In addition to his journalism, analysis, and commentary, he has engaged in political activism. He is a youth organizer for the International Action Center and was involved in the Occupy Wall Street movement from its planning stages in August of 2011. He has worked against police brutality, mass incarceration, and imperialist war. He works to promote revolutionary ideology and to support all who fight against the global system of monopoly, capitalist imperialism. Caleb is a regular contributor to Near East Outlook, and that is www.journal-neo.org, and is on-site editor for Press TV at the United Nations in New York. His website is www.caleb, Maupin, MAUPIN.info. I strongly encourage everybody to take a look at his website because he does a lot of articles, YouTube videos of his work in fighting imperialism, and I love watching him and reading him. For myself, I am at www.44days.net, where this podcast will be posted. How are you doing today, Mr. Maupin?
I'm feeling great, and I'm glad to be on your show. Thanks for having me.
Love to have you. You and I have been kicking this show around for about a month or two, and in fact, it's going to be a series of shows. In my writings, I later than you, much later in life than you, kind of came to the conclusion and the realization that capitalism is very much bound up in imperialism, racism, and colonialism and war. And I, sent you a thing. Let's do a thing and talk about capitalism and compare them. And since I'm living here in Beijing, and compare them to Euro-socialism, capitalism, and then do a program on socialism, and then do one on communism, and then do one on anarchism. And you gladly and happily accepted the offer. And so since capitalism is the 800-pound gorilla that dominates the world and most of the economies across the planet, today's first installment is going to be to talk about capitalism. And what we have done is I'm going to read off some of the common myths about capitalism, and then Caleb, who is eminently qualified, is going to discuss them. Are you ready, Caleb?
I'm ready.
All right. The first myth about capitalism is that it always, and this is what's in all the economics books in college and high school, etc., is the rational use of resources based on supply and demand. What do you think?
Well, I think that if you look at the world today, it's pretty obvious that there's not rational use of resources. In New York City, where I'm living right now, for example, there are 20 empty housing units for every homeless person. There is
an
3 times
statistic.
Yeah, and there's 3 times as much food as is needed to feed the entire human race being produced, yet people are starving all the time. Something like 3,000 people die of malnutrition-related illnesses every day. So there's clearly not rational use of resources. I think that the capitalism of the world today has led to very, very irrational use of resources.
And I'd like to add that we go through these resources cycles of boom and bust, undersupply and oversupply, and the other thing is that and that I have learned in capitalism is that static or declining growth in profits and resource use is verboten. There can only be continuous growth and the continuous use of resources, and obviously our resources are finite, and that myth is also starting to show its limits. Let's talk about.
Yeah, well,
go ahead.
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead,
Caleb.
let me illustrate this point. Back in the 1920s, in the Communist Party, they had kind of a thing they would tell called the miner's riddle. Have you ever heard of this?
No, I haven't.
Well, they say it's in, it took place in a mining town in like West Virginia or Kentucky. And there's a little girl, and she says to her father, "Why is it so cold?" And he says, "Because we can't afford any coal." And then she would say, "Well, why can't we afford any coal?" And he would say, "I've been laid off from my job at the coal mine." And she would say, "Well, why did they lay you off from your job at the coal mine?" And he'd say, "Because there's too much coal, and the price has gone down." That pretty much sums it up. That's the rational use of resources.
I will remember that one. All right, let's go to myth number 2. There's the famous English economist, 19th century economist named Adam Smith, and Wall Street and the White House and capitalists all over the world love to talk about Adam Smith's invisible hand, and that it nobly is guiding society for the betterment of all citizens. What do you think about Adam Smith's invisible hand?
Well, first of all, I think the fact that we relegate some of the most important tasks in the world to an invisible hand is kind of scary. I don't know any parent who would leave their child at home for the evening with an invisible hand watching over them. But the defenders of capitalism are essentially asking us to have an invisible hand, to leave to an invisible hand the task of feeding and clothing and housing the people of the world. And I think that's just highly, highly irresponsible. But furthermore, we can see that the invisible hand is quite irresponsible in the way that it operates. We can just see that that people don't have what they need. The United States is the richest country in the entire world, yet we still have 1 million people who sleep on the streets every night. We still have mass unemployment. The price of education is just skyrocketing. All kinds of examples you can give of the invisible hand proving itself to be just completely incompetent.
Yeah, and of course the tens of millions of, aren't there something like 50 million people in the United States on food stamps?
Precisely.
Yeah, something like that, and 50 million with no health insurance.
Yeah, and food stamps weren't simply created just so people could eat. It wasn't just for the hungry people. It was also for the food corporations.
Yeah.
The food corporations weren't selling enough, and part of the reason that there was kind of an outcry when they cut food stamps recently was because the food corporations were going to lose a lot of money because people wouldn't be buying them. These reforms that have been created aren't only simply just to help people. I mean, that's part of it, is there has been upsurges and struggles among the working class to demand things like food stamps and labor rights, but partially it's because the system just doesn't work. If they abolished food stamps tomorrow, the agribusiness in the U.S. would just be in a huge crisis. The people who defend capitalism, some of these libertarian types, they'll always talk about, the problem is the government, and if we just got rid of the government, well, that's completely not true. A lot of times the reason the government intervenes is to make a system that doesn't work try to work. I mean, the Federal Reserve System was invented by people like J.P. Morgan. It was invented by the biggest bankers because every couple years the stock market would crash. Yeah. They would have a panic, it's called, and everything would go under, and they wanted to kind of stabilize a naturally unstable system.
The other thing that I've learned as far as Adam Smith's invisible hand is what are called, externalized costs, and all the harmful and fatal, social, personal, environmental costs, that capitalism cannot tolerate. And so they externalize the pollution, they externalize the diseases, they externalize the accidents, they externalize all the misery and suffering, so that they have maximum profits. So it is pretty obvious that Adam Smith's invisible hand works for a few people, but for most of us, it's pretty noxious.
Yeah, if it doesn't affect your profit margin, it's an externality, and you're not concerned about it.
That's right. This is kind of tied into the same thing. The myth number 3 is that there's shared prosperity for all across the world. There's shared prosperity.
Well, that's simply not the case. In fact, I think the result of capitalism expanding onto a global level has been impoverishing the third world. I mean, India once had textile mills, and when the British came there, they didn't help them develop their textile mills. They tore them down, so they had to buy their textile from Britain. Bangladesh, they used to call it Sonar Bengal because the cloth that they made there was considered to be the highest quality in the world. And now that's been destroyed, and now people in Bangladesh work in factories making pennies an hour, making clothes for Walmart and the Gap and other some of these factory fires. They've been locked in and burned alive. I mean, it's really horrendous. So there's you can just see that that's simply not the case. Ever since Latin America was opened up to imperialism, beginning in the 90s, the neoliberal intervention that began in Chile. Where they brought in Milton Friedman and under the Pinochet dictatorship, they just privatized it. It was a disaster. And you look at Mexico today. I mean, it's just been disastrous what's been happening there since NAFTA came through. I mean, the country's just fallen apart into a state of decay with drug gangs, and I mean, there's just no economic activity going on. You can go down the line. Penetration by international corporations tends to destroy the domestic economy and make the people completely dependent on the foreign capitalists, destroy any notion of a domestic economy. They don't have a good record. They're not raising the standard of living. That's often a misunderstanding. Even some people on the left fall into this idea that the big corporations are bringing development, and that they're developing the world, and that's simply not the case.
Absolutely, and also because of the expansion of markets, labor becomes commoditized, and once the labor becomes commoditized, workers' pay and prosperity cycle downward, and that's exactly what we're seeing in the United States for the last 20, 25 years. Actually, since the middle 70s, and then now it's starting. It's well on its way in the United Kingdom and starting in continental Europe. So I would go ahead.
They've got workers all over the world competing for who can work for the lowest. The auto workers say, well, we'll work for $20 an hour. So then the auto workers in Mexico say, well, we'll work for $15 an hour. And the auto workers in Bangladesh will work for $10 an hour. And it's we're all racing to the bottom. Who can have the lowest wages, the lowest benefits? Globalization has basically been forcing the standard of living down everywhere in the world. Yeah. It's really bad.
I've also learned that the ultimate goal of capitalism would be if we were all just slaves. I mean, I think that's the ultimate extreme of capitalism is slavery.
But, the problem with slaves, though, is that, with slaves, that you don't pay them a wage. With slaves, you at least are required to give them housing and food until their death. And, see horrific instances. Like, for example, in one of these garment factories in Bangladesh, people were working and they were drinking water, and they were only allowed to drink water out of the company cooler in this one instance. And that was because the water in the company cooler was laced with meth. So they would be working faster,
Oh my
And so these people were drinking meth. After 1 or 2 years working on this job, they would die. It would kill them.
Unbelievable.
And you wouldn't do that with a slave, but with a wage slave, you might do something like that.
Wow. I'd also like to point out, as far as shared prosperity for all, is that you mentioned 3,000 die of hunger every day. 7.5 million children under the age of 5 die every year around the planet, and due to a combination of not having potable water, not having shelter, not having medical care, and not having enough food, and that comes out to about 30,000 a day. So we're going through 10 9/11s a day of children around the world to keep the the Western world prosperous, and very, very unequal.
Yeah, whenever they talk about the evils of communism, they always talk about, quote, man-made famines. There's a man-made famine happening every day because of capitalism.
All right, myth number 4. This noble system will reduce the chances for war because of perfected rational use of resources. We don't need to fight because we're all getting our fair share of the resources. What do you think about that one?
Well, I think it's the opposite. I think a lot of the wars that have happened have been wars to control the markets. It's the big corporations teaming up with the Pentagon that have really discovered that war is a way to make a lot of money and profits, selling the tanks, guns, and weapons, and it's a way to beat down any country that asserts its own economic independence. I think it's the opposite. I think capitalism is driving the wars, frankly.
Yeah, like Venezuela and Ecuador and Bolivia and Nicaragua and Eritrea and not to mention China and everything that they're trying to do to undermine China. And
they target countries that assert their independence.
Yeah, and then also World War One and World War II was all about. World War One was colonial resources, and World War II was Russia's natural resources and trying to get their hands on that. So I would agree with you. It seems to me like war and capitalism go together like a hot dog and a bun.
Yeah. Especially in the USA, the economy in the U.S. is centered around it. In fact, there's so little domestic manufacturing in the U.S. now, but what's left is almost completely military. One of the primary exports from the U.S. at this time is weapons. Keynesianism, it began, the idea was hiring people to do useful work, but now they've got military Keynesianism in the U.S. Part of the Cold War was this development of basically stimulating the capitalist economy with military investment.
Yeah. Which ties into fascism eventually, which we're also starting to see in the United States.
Yes, yes.
All right, golly, this is pretty depressing.
I think we'll have more fun with the next segments.
Myth number 5. Capital goes to those who work the hardest and those who come up with the best market ideas, the best services, etc. It goes to the sort of that Darwinian the best and the brightest deserve the most. What do you think?
Well, I think it's largely the opposite. I know some of the defenders of capitalism have this idea that all the rich people are all inventors and brilliant artists and technicians, but the reality is that most of the people who are rich, they don't even know where their money comes from. Someone else is managing it. They've hired somebody else to manage it. And most of the inventions go on by people who are hired. The people inventing new software programs and such are hired by Microsoft or Apple to sit there all day and get a wage to invent it. But the real rich, I mean, when we talk about rich, that's one confusion we often get. People think, well, capitalism works because I know somebody who grew up in a working class household and now they're a doctor or a lawyer. No, I mean, the real ruling class, the people that really have the power are not doctors, they're not lawyers. They're people who live simply by owning. We're talking about the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Morgans, the Rothschilds, these people that own huge banking institutions, own oil companies, own big mega corporations. Those are the folks that really have the power. That's the real 1%. And I think that's a confusion. People might say, well, maybe, if I really work hard and stay in school, I might be able to make more money than somebody who doesn't. That's not the difference between the working class and the capitalist class. I mean, the people who are rich and are the people who do the least amount of work. And I'll tell you, the people who work the hardest and are really, really, really badly treated tend to be the people that do the lowest paying jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, compare the life of a fast food worker to the life of a stockbroker, for example, I've worked in fast food. When I was in college, I worked in fast food and other places. That is not a good way to spend 40 hours a week, but yet they get the lowest possible pay.
Yeah.
And then the people who have the most money and make the most and have the highest incomes don't do any work. They simply are getting money from having money.
The other thing you mentioned, how it's all the people that work for these corporations that come up with all the great ideas. let's not forget the governments who have done billions and billions and billions of dollars of research over the decades, and then they hand over these wonderful, especially in medicine, space technology, manufacturing technology, and then they turn around and either sell or give these wonderful ideas and patents to corporations who are well connected, for a song. So and then they turn around and spend it into billions of dollars of profits for the owners.
Well, right, and in fact, most major inventions in the U.S. in the last several decades have actually been coming from the government.
Yeah.
The internet was invented by the Pentagon for military purposes.
It's a crazy world we live in. All right,
Yes,
the last myth that we will note today about capitalism is that due to its divine goodness, this righteous system assures freedom and independence for all. This is the idea that capitalism and pluralistic democracy will spread freedom and independence for people all over the planet. What do you think about that, Caleb?
Well, I think that this points to how biased the media is, because whenever there's some leader that is kind of anti-capitalist or fighting the big corporations, they call them a dictator. But you never hear about all the open dictators who are happy to do business with Wall Street. The Saudi monarchy is an absolute dictatorship. There are no elections. There is no constitution. The king, everyone in the country, they're not citizens. They're subjects. They're the property of the king. And Wall Street loves the Saudi monarchy. Mm-hmm. What about the Philippines? In the Philippines, if you so much as own a book published by the Communist Party, you can go to jail for life. You can go to South Korea, where there's a young person who's in jail for tweeting. He tweeted a statement on Twitter that was pro North Korean, and he's in prison for 3 years. There have been all kinds of brutal military dictatorships propped up by the United States and propped up by the big corporations and Wall Street. They're happy to do business with dictators. Yeah. There's no problem with that. And in some cases, they tend to be much friendlier toward dictatorships than they are towards democracies. That's been a back and forth argument. But I know the Kennedy administration at one point was trying to get some of the dictatorships that the U.S. Was supporting, like the Shah of Iran and others, to kind of loosen it up because they felt it was hurting the U.S.'s image around the world. But I mean, look at. I mean, for years in the Philippines, they had the Marcos dictatorship.
The Marcos family.
Yeah, and they were running the country. In Haiti, the U.S. was propping up the Papa Doc, Baby Doc, the Dulavier regime. All over the world, there are dictators who happily do business with Wall Street.
Yeah, the Suharto, General Suharto in Indonesia, and the Burmese junta. Mm-hmm. And people forget, but South Korea and Taiwan after World War II were brutal. Well, after the Korean War and 1949, when Chiang Kai-shek went to Taiwan and South Korea were brutal fascist dictatorships for decades.
No, there's a great movie called Ghosts of Jeju, and it's about the Jeju Island massacre in South Korea. There was an island that was a stronghold of kind of communist and democratic activities, and it was on the island of Jeju. And the South Korean military went there and just slaughtered everyone there. For years they had Syngman Rhee as a dictator, an absolute military dictator ruling over South Korea. And then in the 80s they had Park Chung-hee, another military dictator, yeah. and his daughter is currently the president of South Korea. And actually, even currently today, something in South Korea, the Unified Progressive Party, which is an electoral party in South Korea that calls for peace with the North and all of that, it was forcibly outlawed, and all the leaders are in prison for life because they found a tape recording of them allegedly saying pro-North Korean things. So there's a lot of military dictatorships and repressive regimes supported by the United States. That's very, very clear. You don't hear about them, of course, but they're certainly in existence.
Well, and then the other thing that I've noticed over the years as I've started, doing research and writing books and everything is that the 1%, resorts to a non-stop, litany of false flags, 9/11, Charlie Hebdo, the latest one in France. The freedom and independence, is a bit of a mirage, and cycles down into oppression and fascism in order to maintain control and to keep the system going. And what I find so dispiriting is all the false flags. I mean, it's just nonstop. And then what they do, the MH370, MH17, downed airplanes, etc. And so it's this idea that there's freedom and independence for all is really bogus when if you're willing to sort of step back and look at reality. Well, are you there, Caleb?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, gotcha. All right. No,
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We are on. Well, listen, I think we have done a good job of offering an unorthodox, contrarian view of capitalism. We will then move on to installment number 2. Will be Euro socialism, capitalism. Post-war Western Europe that thought that they could have the best of both worlds, of socialism and capitalism, and be somewhat different than libertarian America. And then the next one up is socialism, and then we'll do an installment on that one. Then we'll do an installment on communism, which I'm really fascinated and look forward to, because I'd like to find out what you think the differences are between socialism and communism. And then we'll move up to everybody's favorite, anarchism. And so I hope everybody's enjoyed this this program, and we will continue to do the rest of these installments and look forward to people's comments and hopefully we'll have educated some people differently than what they think they already know. Caleb?
All right. Sounds
All right.
good.
Well, listen, you have a wonderful
Yes.
time in New York. I'm here in Beijing. This is Jeff Brown at 44 Days Radio Sinoland in Beijing, talking to Caleb Maupin, and I will go ahead and repeat. His website is www.calebmaupin.info in New York City, and Jeff Brown at 44 Days, www.44days.net. We're signing out. Have a wonderful holiday, Caleb, and we'll talk to you about Euro socialism and capitalism next. Bye-bye.